69. That's the number of white bodies buried in a mass grave in West Palm Beach after the 1928 hurricane. They got coffins. They got a plot in Woodlawn Cemetery, the most well-maintained cemetery in the city. They got a plaque with their names. Now remember this other number, 674. That's the number of black bodies, mostly migrant farm workers, thrown into another mass grave, just a few miles away. No coffins, no names, no plaque, for almost 80 years. Both groups died on the same night, in the same hurricane, by the same water. The only difference between getting a grave with a name and becoming a number in an unmarked mass grave was the color of your skin. This isn't a theory. This isn't an exaggeration. It's documented in official records from the state of Florida and the National Register of Historic Places of the United States. Welcome back to The Day After. Today we're talking about the Lake Okeechobee hurricane of 1928, the second deadliest natural disaster in United States history, behind only the Galveston hurricane of 1900, deadlier than Katrina, deadlier than Andrew. And yet, almost nobody knows this story. In this video, you'll discover what really happened that night, with real numbers, real sources, and without making up a single quote. Let's begin. Imagine this. You're sleeping in your house. It's nighttime. Suddenly, you hear a sound. It's not wind. It's not rain. It's a sound like a train approaching. You get out of bed. When you reach the window, you see something impossible. A wall of water 20 feet high coming toward you. There's no time to run. There's nowhere to go. In less than a minute, your house, your family, and your life are swept away. This isn't fiction. This really happened to thousands of people on September 16, 1928. To understand how this was possible, you need to know Lake Okeechobee. It's the second largest freshwater lake entirely within the United States. Over 700 square miles of water. But here's the problem. It's shallow. The average depth is less than 10 feet. The deepest point, less than 12 feet. This means that during a hurricane, the wind can push the entire mass of water from one side of the lake to the other, like water sloshing in a giant bathtub. Except this bathtub contains over 1 trillion gallons. In the 1920s, the area around the lake became one of the most productive agricultural regions in Florida. Sugarcane, winter vegetables. To work these lands, farmers recruited thousands of migrant workers, most of them black men from the Bahamas, the Caribbean, and the southern United States. They were promised jobs. They were promised wages. They were promised a future. What they weren't told was that these workers would live in wooden shacks in communities like Belle Glade, Pahokee, and South Bay, on the southern shore of the lake, protected only by a poorly made earthen dike. This dike had been erected in a makeshift way since the mid-1910s, reinforced in the 1920s. According to accounts from survivors of the time, in some places it was less than 5 feet high. It could barely stop a common flood, let alone a Category 4 hurricane. And here's what makes this even worse. 1 year earlier, in 1926, a hurricane had already broken through this same type of dike and flooded the region. The warning had already been given by nature. Nobody reinforced it enough. The storm that would become the Lake Okeechobee hurricane was born in the Atlantic in September 1928. It passed through Guadeloupe, then through Puerto Rico, where it killed hundreds of people with winds that reached 160 miles per hour, then through the Bahamas. On September 16, 1928, it reached the Florida coast near West Palm Beach as a Category 4 hurricane. Winds estimated between 140 and 150 miles per hour. Communication at the time was limited. There were no satellites. There were no hurricane hunters. There was no radio in almost any rural workers' home. Many people didn't even know the storm was coming, or thought it would pass far away, as it almost had days before. September 16, 1928, night. When the eye of the hurricane passed over the lake, the wind pushed all the dammed water to the south side. The dike, which was already weak, couldn't withstand it. It broke in several places along the shore. A wave of water that survivors at the time described as being between 6 and 20 feet high, depending on the location, swept through the communities. Belle Glade, Pahokee, South Bay, Chosen. Entire houses were ripped from their foundations and carried away by the current, along with whoever was inside. There's a real and well-documented account, recorded decades later in interviews and in the book Killer Kane by historian Robert Michael, the account of Vernie Boots. On the night of the hurricane, Vernie was 14 years old and lived with his family near the lake. Their house was just a few feet from an earthen dike less than 5 feet high. When the water invaded the region, he clung to debris and floated for miles into the interior of the Everglades, along with 2 brothers. All 3 survived. His parents didn't survive. Neither did another brother. Decades later, as an adult, Vernie still lived in Belle Glade and told the story to anyone who asked. He said he remembered everything, that all you had to do was ask. Another survivor, Carmen Salvatore from Pahokee, reported that after a few days it was no longer possible to recognize the bodies collected at the city dock, and that, faced with this, many had to be burned on site for lack of an alternative. By the morning of September 17th, what remained was horror. The official death toll at the time was set at about 2,500. Modern historians believe the actual total reached nearly 3,000, the second highest number of deaths from a natural disaster in United States history, behind only the Galveston hurricane of 1900. The reason for the uncertainty is simple and cruel. Many of the victims were migrant workers without formal registration, without nearby relatives to claim their bodies, without anyone to report them missing. The Red Cross arrived days later. They found bodies everywhere, decomposing in the Florida heat. The smell was unbearable. Disease was a serious threat. They needed to act fast. At first, they tried to bury people individually, but there were too many, and the ground was still saturated with water, so they made a decision: mass graves. And here's the most shocking fact, now fully documented and cataloged by the National Register of Historic Places of the United States. In West Palm Beach, 69 white victims were buried in a mass grave at Woodlawn Cemetery, the city's official cemetery, reserved by law for white people. This grave received a marker as early as 1928. A few miles away, at least 674 black victims, or victims of unidentified race, were buried in another mass grave, in a pauper's cemetery at the corner of Tamarind Avenue and 25th Street. No coffins, no marker. The site was virtually forgotten for decades, until it was officially recognized by the state of Florida only in the early 2000s. There were other smaller mass graves scattered throughout the region, the largest of them in Port Mayaca, to the north, with approximately 1,600 bodies, most of them also black workers. On September 30th, 1928, the city government organized a simultaneous hour of mourning at the 2 main burial sites. At the Paupers Cemetery, about 2,000 to 3,000 people attended. Among them was black educator and activist Mary McLeod Bethune, who read the mayor's proclamation aloud to those present. Meanwhile, state officials and business leaders began to downplay the disaster. Why? Because Florida was still trying to recover from the real estate crash of 1926. Another disaster, especially one so deadly, would destroy what remained of Florida's reputation. The press cooperated. The headlines focused on heroic rescue efforts instead of the death toll, stories about survivors rebuilding instead of mass graves. The phrase "act of God" was used repeatedly, as if this were inevitable, as if the dike hadn't been inadequate from the start, as if a hurricane in 1926 hadn't given the warning. The disaster caught the attention of then-President-elect Herbert Hoover, who personally went to inspect the region. From this, Congress authorized the Army Corps of Engineers to build a much more robust dike around the lake, built mainly between 1932 and 1938, with walls over 30 feet high in several sections. This system was renamed, in 1960, the Herbert Hoover Dike. Today, it's about 143 miles long and protects tens of thousands of people who live around the lake. Curiously, even this definitive dike continued to present structural problems decades later. The Corps of Engineers only completed a full safety overhaul in 2023, almost a century after the original hurricane. In a $1.5 billion project, the dike that should have been built before 1928, the dike that could have saved 3,000 lives. The mass grave on Tamarind Avenue was only officially recognized by the National Register of Historic Places in 2002, almost 75 years after the hurricane. Until then, it was basically a vacant lot in the city, without any plaque. Meanwhile, the white victim's grave at Woodlawn Cemetery had a marker from the beginning. Writer Zora Neale Hurston, who lived in South Florida at the time, used the hurricane as the backdrop for her most famous novel, Their Eyes Were Watching God, published almost 10 years later. The work portrays the desperation of the storm, but even there, the silence about the unequal treatment given to black victims is noticeable. The difference never made headlines at the time. This is the pattern that repeats: Galveston in 1900, Okeechobee in 1928, and, almost 80 years later, New Orleans in 2005, when the poorest and blackest neighborhoods of Katrina were, once again, the ones that received the least help and protection. 69 names with a marked grave, 674 people without names, in a grave that was forgotten for almost 80 years. This isn't a story about a hurricane. It's a story about who society at the time decided was worth remembering, and who they decided could be forgotten. The Lake Okeechobee hurricane of 1928 killed between 2,500 and 3,000 people. Most were black migrant workers. Most were buried in unmarked mass graves. Most were erased from history, not because their lives didn't matter, but because the people in power decided they didn't matter enough to be remembered. If this story impacted you, leave a like, subscribe for more stories like this, and comment. What other disaster do you think was erased from history? See you in the next video.